Good morning, everyone. It's Rabbi Akiva Males. I hope you're well. Today is Friday. It's August 7th, and we're getting ready for Parshas Ekev. I wanted to share a Dvar Torah with you. I was looking at the calendar, and I was just stunned. Tonight, Friday night, the Hebrew date that's going to begin is Yud Ches, the 18th of Av, and that's Shabbos. This week, Shabbos is the 18th of Av. And the 18th of Av is etched in my memory, is a date that's very important significance. The 18th of Av in 1929, that was the year of Tarpat, 1929, Tafresh Peites. That was the year and the Shabbos that took place, the Hebron massacre, wherein 67 Jews who were living in Hebron were ruthlessly murdered by frenzied Arab mobs. And that occurred on the 18th of Av, and it was a Shabbos, just like this year, and it was Parshas Ekev. The dates followed, it was 91 years ago. This Shabbos is the 91st anniversary, the yahrzeit of 67 Kedoshim who were butchered in Hebron. And amongst those 67 who were killed by a frenzied Arab mob, amongst them were 25 Bachurim, 25 yeshiva students of Yeshivas Knesset Yisrael. That was a branch of the famed Slobodka Yeshiva in Lithuania. They had opened a branch in Hebron, and by 1929, it had close to 200 students who were studying Torah there, Yomam V'Layla. And amongst those 200 students, there was about 24 English-speaking American students. And tragically, several of them were wounded and murdered amongst those 25 yeshiva students who were killed during the Hebron massacre. So again, there were 67 Jews in total. 25 of them were yeshiva students, and of those 25, several were Americans who were murdered and wounded. One of them was a native Memphian. One of them, his name was Aaron David Shainberg, Zichrono Livracha, and he was murdered in 1929. Upon moving to Memphis, I quickly learned that he was an uncle, a beloved uncle, of two wonderful, many members of our community, but two that live right here among us. One was Mrs. Joan Baum, and the other is Mrs. Diane Rubel. Both of them, after Layla and I moved here, and I had a chance to sit down and talk with them and tell them my interest and how I had every year try to speak about the Kedoshim, those martyrs who were killed during the Hebron massacre. And they told me their beloved Uncle Dave, as they know him, he was one of the Kedoshei Hebron. He was one of the martyrs of that pogrom, of that Hebron massacre. And each year as the Yud Ches Av rolls around, I try to share something about those Kedoshei Hebron, those Jews who were killed in Hebron 91 years ago. And again, what struck me is that how the confluence of the dates and the day of the week and the Parshas HaShavua absolutely lines up. Yud Ches Av is the Shabbos, Parshas Ekev, the same day of the week, the same Hebrew date on the calendar. I want to share a picture with you. And this picture that I'm going to share is the Rosh Yeshiva. He was the head of the Slobodka Yeshiva, the Knesset Yisrael, the branch that moved to Hebron. And again, this name was Rabbi Moshe Mordechai Epstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Rav Moshe Mordechai, as he was always referred to and was known, he was the Rosh Yeshiva. He headed the Slobodka Yeshiva in Lithuania. And when it opened its branch in Israel, he left with the contingent, him and the Alter Slobodka, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, the two of them left to start up this branch in Eretz Yisrael and Hebron, which became incredibly successful and tragically suffered so terribly during this massacre, after which it relocated to Yerushalayim. So now one of the largest yeshivas in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem today, is known as the Hebron Yeshiva. The Hebron Yeshiva is this yeshiva, is the Knesset Yisrael, the Slobodka Yeshiva. After the massacre in Hebron, it moved, it relocated to Yerushalayim and refounded itself there. Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein was the Rosh Yeshiva. He was in Hebron that Shabbos. This is a picture of him on the screen. And his house, it's a whole story. His house was not attacked. He survived, miraculous, and all the Bachrim who had fled and made it to his house, they survived as well. But he was heartbroken. He died in 1933, and he never got over this. He never got over his beloved yeshiva, what they had suffered at this massacre, and the 25 students who had lost their lives. I want to share with you something from his own words. A year after the Hebron massacre, so in 1930, the students of the yeshiva published a Sefer Zikaron, a memorial book. Here's the title, just the title page of it. It was a Sefer Zikaron that was printed by the students a year later. And it has in it Divrei Torah from many of the students, but it also has obituaries, memorials that were written to each of the 25 students who were murdered, and it tells something about them. And of course, there's a section in there about Dave Schoenberg, as I said, a native of Memphis, Tennessee, very special young man who was cut down in the prime of his life, but had such a promising future ahead of him. The beginning of this Sefer Zikaron has about 4 or 5 pages from Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein that he contributed to this memorial volume. And I want to share with you just a few lines of what he wrote. He writes as follows. He says, a year has gone by since that terrible tragedy and the murder of so many Jews in Hebron, and amongst them were 25 of our beautiful students who had such promising futures ahead of them. And let me read and translate with you something that he wrote. Chazal Amru, our sages taught us, one of the decrees that God in his ultimate wisdom made, was he made a rule of nature, that a family member who has lost a loved one, after 12 months go by and the grieving process has taken some effect, some of those bitter feelings, again, the person will never forget totally the fact that he had a loved one who's no longer here, but some of that intense feeling of mourning dissipates. And God just made the world work this way in order that we should be able to continue. But we cannot forget the memory of those students, those young students who were butchered. We grieve for them on a daily basis, and we can't possibly find comfort. And all of his Talmidim write this about him. His students write that he died 4 years later, and he was just absolutely broken from the death of these students. Let me skip, and I want to read to you just a few paragraphs at the end. This tremendous tragedy, Harigas Bachorei Yeshiva Akdosha Bechevron, the killing, the murder of those students of the Holy Yeshiva in Hebron, Asher Hayumayim Gaonim, they were such geniuses, Vikim B'Shas, they had a mastery of Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, they had a mastery of Gemara, Charifim Atzuvim, they were so bright, Asher Ekdishu Kishronoseim Anifloim LeToras Hashem V'das Hashem, and they dedicated all of their mental abilities to get a grasp on the Torah and on an understanding of God in heaven. Gedolei Hadas V'Abina, they were such people of such great stature of intellect and understanding. Who Asan Klali, this is a communal tragedy, Asher Yevsher Lisnachem, from which we cannot find comfort. Afim Avru Yamim Rabim, even if many days go by. And skipping to the end, he specifically writes what hurt him the most. As we said, there were several Americans who were murdered and some were wounded during this. Amongst them was Dave Schoenberg. And he says, how can we possibly accept any comfort? Al Ela Yikarim Shenadu Me America, from those students who were murdered, who traveled all the way from America to come and study Torah here. He says, amongst them were Asher Azvu Avoseim Shpachosayim. Some of them left their families and their parents behind. V'chol Sason Achayim, and all of their happiness of their life. And he says, and they gave it all up and gave up all the creature comforts of home to come to a city of Hebron in 1929. There was very few houses that had running water, and they were coming from America to this, and some of them were coming from affluent homes like Dave Schoenberg. But they were happy to be here, and they were happy with their lot. Because they tasted the sweetness of the Torah here. And they found spiritual nourishment, and that's what sustained them. This was such a sanctification of God's name that they gave up all those comforts in America, and they came here to Hebron to study Torah. And at the end of the paragraph, he says, these young students, they were such giants in terms of their knowledge and in terms of their awe of heaven. And even though they knew this world and they knew what it meant to enjoy material success, Asher Azvu Avosem Shpachosayim, they gave that all up and they left their family, their parents, their family behind. Manimei Achayim, they gave up all the sweetness of life. V'yismasru l'Torah bilvav merucham, and they completely gave themselves over here, where there was no creature comforts, to study Torah and to sustain their spirits. Kama hayu mashpiyim b'shuvam lebeso. Can you even imagine what type of a positive influence they would have had on their families and their communities had they only been allowed to return home? They would have returned home filled to the brim with Torah, V'yira, and all sorts of Yiras Hashem, awe of heaven. v'das u'tvuna v'midos chamudos, and they would have had such exemplary character traits. What positive influence they would have been on their communities, on their families. They could have turned communities over, those boys. Hayesh b'koach enosh lishkoach osam. How could we possibly forget them? And that's what Rav Moshe Mordechai was lamenting. Here it is a year later, and he's saying we can't find comfort, especially when I think about those American boys who were butchered, and I think about them, all that they could have accomplished, what they gave up with such mesiras nefesh, with such sacrifice to come study Torah, and what they accomplished while they were here, and the impact they would have had on their communities back home had they only been allowed to return. That's what he lamented. And that's to me, that's such a powerful statement. And look at those words from a loving Rosh Yeshiva, from someone who loved his students. And here he was, unable to find comfort. Now, this concept that Rav Moshe Mordechai is lamenting, this idea that had these students only been able to return home, they would have had such a positive impact on so many other Jews, whether it was their family, their community. This idea resonates so strongly in Parshas Ekev. Because in Parshas Ekev, we find the second paragraph of Shema, which begins with V'hayah Yishamoah. And Shema, this second paragraph of Shema ends with such a familiar refrain. We say it every day, multiple times. It's our responsibility to transmit, to give over this information to our children, to the children of our communities, that they should become familiar with the Torah and the mitzvahs as well. That's our responsibility. We don't just live in a silo where we say, I'm going to learn Torah and observe mitzvahs and it's just going to be for me. We want to be influential. We want to have an impact, a positive impact on all the Jews in our orbit, everyone around us, whether it's our family members, our neighbors, our community. We want to have an impact on everybody around us. And that's the directive. That's what Hashem asks of us when he says, and that's what Rav Moshe Mordechai was lamenting, because he was saying, these Jews, these American boys who were in our yeshiva, they accomplished so much, and they would have done so much in the world of and they were robbed of that opportunity, and he was heartbroken about that. The Gemara in Baba Basra, and Chaf Aleph, Amid Aleph, tells us something fascinating, which relates to those words that we say every day. Let me read to you the Gemara. The Gemara says as follows: Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, I want to tell you about someone that all generations have a debt of gratitude for, and we will always remember with positive feelings. Yoshua ben Gamla Shemo. That was his name, Yoshua the son of Gamla. Shilmolehu, if it were not for Yoshua ben Gamla, Nishtacha Torah Yisrael. The Torah would have been absolutely forgotten from the Jewish people. Why? Shebetchila, originally, you know how the system worked? Mishi Yeshlo Av, if there was a boy who had a father, Melamdo Torah, the father would teach that boy Torah. Misha Ein Lo Av, if someone did not have a father, Lo Ayalame Torah, that boy never learned Torah. My Darush, how did they look at the Torah, and where did they get this idea from? This erroneous idea that if someone has a father, is there a responsibility for that child to learn Torah? But if that boy doesn't have a father, or the father's too busy, or the father's not learned, then that boy doesn't learn Torah. What erroneous how did they reach such an erroneous conclusion? So he says, because of the pasuk, it says, "V'limadatem osames b'nechem." But if you look at how the Torah spells osam, it does not spell it maleh, it does not spell it full. It's not spelled aleph, vav, taf, mem. It's spelled chaser, it's missing the vav. So it's just spelled aleph, taf, mem, which could be read atem. So he says, v'limadatem atem. It looks like it's a directive to fathers. V'limadatem atem b'nechem. Is that you fathers, you have to teach your son. Meaning, if there is no father, either Nebuch, the kid's a yasom, he's lost his father, or the father is too busy, just is away. He's not someone who lives at home. He's away for work, or he's not learned enough. Then there's no one who has an obligation to teach those children. So what did Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla say? He says, no, that's not. Don't make such a mistake. There's no such drasha. There's no such way to learn the Torah this way. He says, we're setting up yeshivas. We're setting up day schools. We're going to have people to teach children in Yerushalayim, and from Yerushalayim, it spreads to the rest of Eretz Yisrael, and that's the darshan based on the pasuk of Kimitzion Teitzei Torah Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim. It was this innovation. Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla said, we're starting a day school movement. That was that innovation that spread Torah from Yerushalayim throughout the Jewish people. And there would be no one out there just because they didn't have a father, or they didn't have a father who was capable of learning with him, or they didn't have a father who was home, he was so busy with work, or whatever it may be, none of that was an excuse for any Jewish child not to have a Jewish education. Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla put an end to it. It says, "V'limadatem osamas b'neichem." We have a responsibility to teach our collective children. It's not limited just to a father to teach his son. It's to the collective. The whole community has a responsibility to teach the children of our community and ensure that they have a Jewish education. That's Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla, Zocher Latov, and we always have to remember him for a good name. And that's all based on this week's parsha. V'limadatem osamas b'neichem. I thought this is so apropos for a number of reasons. Number one, look how this ties into the yurtzeit of those Kedoshei Chevron, of those sanctified martyred Jews who were killed in Hebron 91 years ago this Shabbos. Look how Rav Moshe Mordechai lamented the fact that those American Bachrim, those American students they were robbed of the opportunity of returning back and fulfilling V'limadatem osamas b'neichem. They would have been mashpiim, they would have been positive, they would have had a positive impact, and they would have been positive influencers on their families, on their communities. And he says it broke his heart to see that they were robbed of that opportunity. But then when we delve deeper into those words, "V'limadatem osamas b'neichem," we see that that's what Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla based the idea of a Jewish day school movement was all based on. It wasn't on an individual parent's responsibility to educate the child. It was a communal responsibility. We have to see to it as a community. "V'limadatem osamas b'neichem." We have to see to it that our children, our collective children, receive a Jewish education. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla begins the day school movement. And after that point, there's no child who would be deprived of a Jewish education just because they didn't have a father or didn't have a father who was capable of teaching Torah. That's Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamla. And I think this is so apropos at this time of the year specifically. In about a week and a half, our day school, our Margolin Hebrew Academy here in Memphis is going to reconvene. And every year when we're at this stage, I always ask the shul to daven for us, all the teachers who are going to be teaching our community's children, your children, our community's children. Daven for us as this new school year begins, that we should be successful in fulfilling this mandate of V'limadatem osamas b'neichem. Daven for us, but specifically daven for us this year. We know that we're coming off, we're still not finished with it. We're in the midst of the coronavirus. Baruch Hashem, to some degree or another, there's been some improvements, but we're still in the middle of a pandemic. And the school is working so hard to begin to open, because everyone recognizes that although we were able in the last several months of this past school year to do the best that we can with Zoom, that wasn't the optimal way to provide our children with a Jewish education or a general studies education. The best way to provide the children with an education is to do so in person. However, it has to be done safely. And the school has been working all summer long to come up with protocols, to enact protocols and ask for cooperation based on the entire community buying into it. What we can do to foster such an environment that can be safe for learning and provide the optimum level of education for the children of our community. And it's a work in progress. And in about a week and a half, we're going to put it into place. And we're trying so hard. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot that's going to be learned in the process. But we're asking for everyone's communication, but we're also asking for everyone's tefillos. We're asking for everyone's tefillos that the teachers in our community should succeed at this idea of V'limadatem osamas b'neichem in our efforts to educate the children of our community's children. We should succeed in that effort. And number two, the school should succeed in creating the safest environment possible that could foster this education, and that there should be no problems. Everything should be running smooth, and everyone should be healthy. I hope that these collective tefillos that we have, and I ask everyone, please daven for this, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem should answer our collective tefillos. He should see to it that we're able to fulfill this dictum of V'limadatem osamas b'neichem, is that all of us should be able to participate, to support our school, to be able to educate the children of our community, and that the school should be matzliach, it should succeed in its efforts. Very, very challenging times, but they've worked so hard over the summer, and they're continuing to work hard to provide our children of our community with the safest environment so they can receive the optimal Jewish and general studies education that they deserve, and that we remember Yeshua ben Gamla as being responsible for setting the template for. So all of us, may Hashem answer the tefillos from each and every one of us. May He enable our teachers to provide the kids with that education. May enable the school to provide the safe environment. And all of us have to be partners on that, to work together to make sure that that safe environment can be created. And lastly, Hashem in his infinite kindness, he should bring an end to our suffering. He should remember the zechusim, all the merits of those Yishenei Chevron, those who now slumber, those who were laid to rest in Chevron, joining our avos and imos, our lofty ancestors, our matriarchs, our patriarchs, and those Kedoshei Chevron, those saints, those martyrs of Chevron, who are now the Yishenei Chevron, who have joined those who slumber in Chevron. All in their zechus, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu end this pandemic and bring health, happiness, and security to our world once again. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.